Hello, everyone. I know we still have some people joining us, but I'd like to take this moment to welcome you to our Musically Speaking online concert preview. 200 years ago, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony was first performed in Vienna, Austria, and this week you can hear it live at Symphony Hall with lots of people, the Handel and Haydn Society Chorus, the Handel and Haydn Society Orchestra, and the chamber choir singers from the H&H Youth Choirs program, all conducted by Raphael Pichon. Thank you for joining us for these concerts this weekend and also for joining us tonight. I'm Emily Marvosh. I'm here as always with H&H's Christopher Hogwood Historically Informed Performance Fellow Teresa Neff. Hi, Teresa.
Hi, Emily. Good to see you.
Teresa is still giving, don't worry, she's still giving in-person Musically Speaking concert previews before each concert. But I'm glad that we can continue to offer this online preview for those who can't make it. There are a few housekeeping notes here before I introduce our additional guests. This presentation will be recorded for future viewers, or if you would like to rewatch it. And I'd also like to mention that this weekend's concerts are at a slightly different time. If you have a ticket for Sunday afternoon, that concert begins at 2 o'clock, not at 3 o'clock. And tickets are selling very, very well. So tell your friends if they haven't got tickets yet, now is the time to do it. I am also so pleased that this online format gives us the opportunity to talk to more musicians. So we do have two musicians joining us tonight. First of all, Guy Fishman is H&H's principal cellist. I know he's back there. We'll get his camera on here for us. He's also on the cover of here he is, Guy Fishman, ladies and gentlemen. He's on the cover of the program book this weekend. And you are. You should check it out. It's you and Sarah Freiberg. Yep, you're right there. Cover model.
The mail.
Royalties for cover photos. And we're also joined from the inside of her car by flutist Alexa Raine-Wright. She'll be playing second flute on Beethoven's symphony this weekend. Hello, Alexa. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
A couple of questions for you all before we move into Teresa's presentation tonight. Guy, how many times have you performed Beethoven's Ninth Symphony?
Not only is this my sixth time, which I mean, maybe for an orchestral musician, it's not that many. For me, it's a lot. They've only ever been on period instruments. I've never done it with a modern orchestra, and mostly with H&H. So
all right.
6 times.
Great. And later on, after Teresa's presentation, I do want to talk about historical instruments and Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. So I'm looking forward to getting to that. Alexa, tell us about your history with Beethoven's Ninth Symphony.
This is my first time performing it in its entirety. I'm really looking forward to it, and a tiny bit intimidated, but don't tell anyone.
So your secret is safe with all of us. Teresa, I read, I believe this is correct, that when the recording industry was moving from records and tapes into CDs, they had to sort of decide how long a CD was going to be, and they chose the length of a CD based on the length of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Is that correct?
That's how I heard the story too. Yeah, because you don't want to keep flipping sides on it. Right. And so it became the gold standard for the length of a CD.
All right. Okay. It's a great piece that we are working on this week with Raphael Pichon. So, Teresa, we will hand it over to you to give us some musical background on the piece. It's all yours.
Right. Thanks. I will share my screen with everyone. There we go. All right. Symphony number 9 is expansive in so many ways, and I just wanted to touch on a few of those with our time this evening. I think the most obvious one that Emily already alluded to is just how long this symphony is, just over an hour of music. If you think about this by comparison, Beethoven's first symphony was about 25 minutes of music. So just the time expanse is something that's really quite remarkable. Secondly, what I've put up in the screen here is the instrumentation. And you'll notice that the instruments that are in italics, these are instruments that Beethoven has added to the standard orchestra. So the highest of the woodwinds, the piccolo, the lowest of the woodwinds, the contrabassoon, trombone to the brass section, more percussion in addition to timpani, and of course, chorus and soloists. All of this expands the number of players we need to perform the symphony. And as Emily said, our chorus will be augmented by the youth chorus. And so we'll probably have over 100 people on stage when all is said and done. Beethoven also takes us to a place of expansion with the music itself. And what I'd like to do now is just go to the opening of the first movement. And I've laid it out here. It is about expectation. And so much about this symphony is about how Beethoven sets out this initial sense of expectation in the opening of the first movement, and then gives us all of these possible solutions or answers to this uncertainty, and doesn't settle on an answer until we get into the fourth movement. So what we first hear are horns in parallel fifths, violin two, cellos in the same place, and then just these little drops of intervals that give us a sense of something about to happen. If you know this work, you know that it begins very quietly. I will also warn you that my excerpt purposefully cuts off very abruptly, just as the crescendo begins. So here's our very opening of Symphony Number 9. Now that moment is something that's really quite wonderful because it continues as it builds, and it gives us our second idea, which is this descending idea played by the whole orchestra, forte, and it's one fulfillment of this very uncertain opening. And here's that continuation. And that brings us back to where we started. In the first movement, Beethoven brings us back to this uncertain opening 4 different times. And in the course of doing that, he gives us different solutions and builds up this wonderful sense of expectation. In the second and third movements, he'll do similar kinds of patterns, but it's only when we get to the fourth movement, after we have had this opening that is quite bold and was actually described by a 19th century reviewer. He said that the opening of the fourth movement sounded like the crashing of a hammer. And you get these just kind of crisis moments. And out of that emerges what we call the Ode to Joy theme, And if you look at this theme, it's very connected. It doesn't have those leaps that we heard in the first movement. It's an incredibly smooth kind of melodic idea. It moves at a very steady kind of pace, not long, short, kind of jagged rhythms, but something very smooth and elegant. It feels very folk-like, and you know, it's such a popular tune that it was actually taken over by churches as a hymn. And that's led to a lot of confusion. Did Beethoven write this first, or was it a hymn first? And in fact, Beethoven wrote this first, but it got taken over as a hymn, which adds just a whole other layer of meaning to kind of how widely received this theme and the entire symphony really is. If we listen to this opening, this is when we hear it played by the cello and bass. We are into the fourth movement. Beethoven has presented us with snippets of movements 1 through 3. He has rejected those, and now we hear for its, in the first time, the full statement of the Ode to Joy. And like the first movement, other instruments get added. And from here, Beethoven creates this wonderful sense of growth again, another way of fulfilling the uncertainty or the expectations that he's created by that very first movement opening. We know that's not the end of the story, because even this statement by the full orchestra is ultimately reshaped by Beethoven as he brings in soloists and chorus, and then between the two, the voice and the instruments, we finally get that sense of fulfillment that Beethoven has been hinting at and suggesting from the very, very beginning of the symphony. And it's with that thought in mind that I'd like to invite back Guy and Alexa and Emily and talk a little bit. Guy, if we can start with you. You get to play this Ode to Joy theme for the first time. It's the first statement of it complete. But right before this, cello and bass are also playing what is essentially a recitative, but there's no text. So it's only after we hear the text sung later in the movement do we realize what Beethoven's actually been asking of the instruments, and that is to sing. And I know that we've talked about that in the past, that, you know, instrumentalists often use the idea of singing as part of their interpretation. But do you hear this or see this as unusual or different, or is it just something that kind of fits right in with how you would normally play?
Well, I think that the use of basses and cellos together is not particularly unusual. By the time Beethoven composed this piece, they had been doing that for a long time, sharing the same line in an orchestra. I think the most unusual thing about it, not even the fact that, I mean, Beethoven at this time was also writing string quartets where he had some recitatives for first violin accompanied by the rest of the ensemble. So I think he was playing around with this idea of not just singing, but speaking, because recitative, as many in our audience knows, is a vocal representation of speech. It's where the action kind of moves in an opera or a cantata. It's where a lot of information is being given to the listener. This is a very singy kind of arioso recitative. I mean, But really, what's the most unusual about it is that it's the moment in the music where if you've been paying attention, and I can only imagine what it was like the first time people heard this thing. I mean, now we know, but it's also possible to know this piece and not realize that Beethoven had written these three massive, incredibly complex and inventive and incredible movements as a setup to be rejected when the singer comes in and says, no, not these sounds. We want something else. It's all been a setup. This entire symphony has been setting up, and it's the cellos and basses that get to interrupt the entire orchestra that's trying to bring it. Wasn't that nice? Wasn't the second movement nice? Wasn't the third movement? And we get to be the ones that say no, which in a way is a very, very central role for a pair of instruments that in an orchestral setting are not necessarily accustomed en masse, in the entire section to take on that kind of leadership role and that central role in the composition. It's a really dramatic, not to mention that you're basically doing what Wagner would do 40 years later or something, give you the material, the melodic material that the singer is going to sing 3 hours later. We're presaging what the baritone comes in with. And that's a lot of role for a group of instruments that among them in the first performances counted people from Hungary, people from Vienna, people with very different or playing styles, some amateurs, but he just got whoever he could get. He tried to get the best bass player in Europe, Dragonetti, who played 3-string bass that nobody else did in Vienna. They might have played 5-string bass. It was really a hodgepodge of an orchestra. And to give these people this role that's, I think, significant. The actual notes, we've played harder things in Beethoven symphonies, but the musical role is unprecedented.
Yeah, Guy, I'm glad you said that about this symphony would have been shocking for so many people for so many reasons, not least that all of a sudden there's a choir that may have just been sitting up on stage for 3 whole movements just waiting. When are they going to come in? When are they going to come in? When are they going to come in? But Alexa, I want to ask you a little bit about instruments. We do have a question from one of our audience members, and I'll say anyone viewing today, we would love to hear questions from you about this weekend's concert, and you can ask those questions by using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. But Alexa, back when this was premiered 200 years ago, there were no modern instruments versus historical instruments. There were only instruments. And from your perspective as a flutist, what will we expect to see and hear from your particular instrument?
That's a great point to make, because a lot of if you compare woodwind development over the centuries compared to string development, there are, I believe, a lot more readily obvious developments over the centuries with wind instruments. The flutes of this time, I have mine assembled here in my car. They're still made of wood. So the base looks very much like a Baroque flute still, but we start to get hardware along the sides, and we get a number of keys. This model that I'm playing on right now has 8 keys. And interestingly, they are not the same key system as modern flutes use today at all. So the flute key system was rehauled at the end of the 1800s and really only adopted at the very, very end of that century. So what these keys do, the fingerings are not quite as intuitive as the modern flute fingerings, but what they do is that they take those quote unquote weak fingerings of the Baroque flute, that such as like the accidentals, like the F sharp, the F natural, or the G sharp, or the B flat, and opening holes elsewhere in the flute with a little lever suddenly makes those notes just as strong as the main notes of the flute. So that is very useful when you only have 2 flute players against a whole horde of string players and you really want them to pop. You want your B flats to sound just as loud as the G's. So that's really exciting. And that said, also, the flutes at this time, like composers of this time, were pushing the instruments to be developed further. One of my favorite quotes from one of my friends described it as like if you're playing Beethoven 9 on a modern flute, it kind of feels comfortable. It's not so hard. It's not so difficult. There's high notes, but it fits pretty well in the flute. But that's like driving 120 in a Ferrari. Whereas playing Beethoven 9 on historical instruments, it's kind of like going 80 in a VW bug. So it's like it's exciting. You're really pushing the instrument to the max, and you know that the composer was doing that too. So I think it adds a little bit of extra thrill to the experience.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about the length of this of the symphony. And normally when you go to an H&H concert, you'll hear one piece, and then maybe there'll be some shifting around, and maybe some players will leave the stage and different players will come on stage. But this is, everybody will be sitting there and performing this piece sort of in its entirety. Guy, are there any issues with like stamina and focus that you have to think about in this piece that you've experienced in the past versus a sort of typical H&H concert?
I'll never admit to that, of course, in public. I think that, playing a piece like Messiah, where the cello plays practically the entire time, cello, bass, and keyboard are playing basically the whole time. In a way, I mean, it's both. There are benefits to it because you get into a role and you just go and you're doing what you're trained and to do. And if you are careful and aware of how you feel, and you find places to be a little less physical, and other places that really require it. The real challenge for me with this, I mean, this piece doesn't really require that. It's got plenty of places to take a breather. I mean, even a few seconds to just kind of calm the nervous system, and you're not playing, and then you come back in. And in an orchestral setting where everybody's in your section is basically doing the same thing, which is not necessarily the case in a Baroque setting, then in an orchestral setting, you can balance how much energy you actually have to put out, because there's strength in numbers. And for this, we will have a relatively large cello section. We have 6, and we're playing Brahms's Requiem in a little bit. We'll have 8 for that. That's about as large as H&H ever has in the cello section. So there's strength in numbers, but Beethoven in his late works has a knack for putting the hardest music last. If you care to listen to a string quartet, Opus 132 in A minor, very, very long, 45 minutes for a string quartet, which is very, very long, very difficult. And the hardest bit for the cello, personally speaking, is the very last page, where he has these unforgiven, very, very difficult solos in the ensemble. And you've just been playing this 43 minutes, and now you're going to do this. And a similar thing happens here. The most difficult, the music I have my cello here next to me. I was practicing before this talk. The music I really have to look at before the first rehearsal is the last couple of pages of the 4th movement. And so you kind of, that's coming. But when it comes, depending on whether the conductor keeps Beethoven's tempo markings or not, it's over in a blink of an eye, and you just have to save focus for that. You have to, you really have to save it. So it's a matter of planning, really.
Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned the conductor, because it's the pacing of this piece is a collaboration between him as well. And the conductor for this concert is Raphael Pichon, and he last conducted the Handel and Haydn Society last season in The Marriage of Figaro, the concert semi-staged version that we did. And Guy, I know you were on that concert. Based on your experience with Maestro Pichon and opera, do you have any predictions of how this symphony might go with him at the helm?
Well, there are, to us at H&H and people who perform this on period instruments, we tend to care a lot about how much the conductor will heed Beethoven's demands. Especially Beethoven, later in his life, went through many of his works and gave metronome marks to them. And there are we know exactly how fast Beethoven wanted this piece to go. And sometimes it's relatively comfortable. Sometimes it's really breakneck, like the Hallelujah chorus. When everybody, that's extremely fast, the way Beethoven wants it to be. So I don't know which way Raphael will go. He's an extremely inventive. What he does demand from the orchestra is to constantly be inventing the music. In Mozart, there are fewer directions of how to play the piece. In earlier music, even less, but the message is always the same. You have to make something happen. Otherwise, sitting back in a piece like this is just not recommended. So I expect it to be a very inventive and exciting. And if you come both nights, you'll probably hear two different performances. So
Okay. Teresa, I mentioned earlier that this piece was performed 200 years ago, but by that point, the Handel and Haydn Society was already in existence. And we know that H&H knew about Beethoven. Will you tell us just very briefly about the sort of communication between the two of them?
Sure. So about 1820, late 1822, a commission was sent to Beethoven. No money that I know of, but an inquiry as to whether Beethoven would write an oratorio for the Handel and Haydn Society. He wrote to a friend in England late in 1822 how delighted he was that his reputation had made it across, the ocean. He never wrote a note. He never wrote back to H&H that I know of, but he was definitely on our radar, and it was really cool to think that we were on his radar as well.
Cool. Yeah, that's really neat to think about what could have been there if he had written something. H&H did a lot of world premieres and certainly American premieres of pieces over the years. So we're glad to be part of this. I know we are reaching up to 8 o'clock. I have one closing question for the three of you, but we do have a question from an audience member about the timpani and whether the timpani will be a period instruments as well. Yes, the timpani will be period instruments with animal hides, and these instruments belong to the Handel and Haydn Society. You've seen them on stage before, and I'm sure it will be very impressive as Beethoven intended. And then one more note before the final question. The concert on Saturday is at 2 o'clock. I misspoke earlier. It's not Sunday at 2 o'clock, Saturday at 2 o'clock. You won't want to miss if you have Saturday tickets. But one more closing question for all of you. I'll start and then I'll turn it over to Alexa. Is there something, one little tiny corner of this piece that you're really excited about, or that you really want audiences to tune into? And mine is in the fourth movement. Teresa's sound sample just started to turn down as it got to it, but after the sort of ode to joy theme, the bassoon comes in with this really awesome counter melody, which is just like a different tune that kind of comes along at the same time, and that counter melody is just one of my favorite parts in this whole symphony. So I love to listen for it. It's a cue to perk up your ears when you're in the choir as well. Alexa, what should we be listening out for as you play this piece?
My favorite part is at the beginning of the first movement. Actually, I love, if we think backwards, coming from Handel, let's say, the woodwinds are really a color in the orchestra. But as we progress and we're in this ninth symphony now, suddenly the woodwinds, and especially the flutes, I think, have this exquisitely independent role, and we're really in conversation, in dialogue with the strings, and you get to hear every single wind instrument by itself or in pairs, like really a unique voice in all of that. And I think that's just an incredible counterpoint by Beethoven.
Right. Yeah. Teresa, what do you think?
Oh, in the fourth movement, at the line, beyond the stars he must dwell, Beethoven takes us to, it's a precipice, right? And we're just there. And I'm sure it's very difficult to sing because everybody's up high, the instruments are up high, we're just hanging there, right? Emily, this must be hard. And it's just wonderful because like all the possibilities are right there in that moment. So I love that moment.
All right, Guy, I'll give you the last word.
There are no moments in this piece that I find extraneous or don't understand the value of or dislike, frankly. And there are many that are transcendent. So I would leave the audience with a recommendation instead of listening to one of my favorite moments. There are many, which negates the term favorite. I just love them all. I would listen, and not to put pressure on Alexa and her colleagues in the back of the stage, but I would listen to the wind writing this entire symphony to get a sense. I mean, you said it already, and I want to second it. To get a sense of a moment in time where you really know that both composers and players have a choice to make about how they're going to move forward. We know what choice they made. They chose to expand on the abilities of their instruments, because this music pushes these instruments in terms of range and loudness and articulation and power as a section versus a very large string. It pushes it farther than it had ever been before. Nobody had ever heard anything like this, literally. And a chance to hear this on period instruments is a chance in this regard to really get a sense that you can hardly get in any other piece of music ever. Evolution of instruments is usually pretty slow, and in this case, it was like if anybody was going to try to top this thing, they literally would not have been able to unless certain things happened in the winds. And I fully expect our very excellent players to match the demands of this piece, but even when they match it, you hear the instruments straining at certain moments. And that's by design. It's not like Beethoven didn't know that was going to happen. It's a signal to instrument makers and players. We're moving, and if I write a 10th one, you better have a new flute ready. So as much as I adore, obviously, the string writing, the singing is incredible, brass playing is incredible. The winds is where you get this opportunity to see into the past and really understand it. So I recommend listening to that.
Yeah. Do you think that that's one of the reasons that composers throughout the rest of the 1800s became so intimidated by Beethoven? That it wasn't only the notes on his page, but what he demanded and achieved from his players.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I don't know how a 10th symphony would have gone. I mean, we're not even talking about the construction of the work and the material and how it's used, and you know, it's absolutely astounding from an architectural standpoint and a compositional standpoint. There was no model for this. There's nothing, it just came out of his head. And the Eighth Symphony gives no sense that this is
No
coming.
hint. Yeah.
It's kind of backwards looking. I took the answer from it, but I'm not sure if anybody else has a different answer, but yeah.
Well, you heard it from Guy. I mean, come this weekend and hear this, as you may not have heard it before. It will be a fantastic performance. So if you have your tickets already, thank you for joining us, joining the H&H Choir and Orchestra and the Youth Choir's Chamber Choir Singers. Just a couple more announcements. Again, Saturday, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and the 24-25 season subscriptions are now on sale. This is a way to get advance tickets before single tickets go on sale. You can renew or buy a new subscription. That's at handelandhaydn.org, or you can visit the patron table this weekend at Symphony Hall. Thank you, Guy, Alexa, and of course, Teresa. Thank you so much for all of your insights and everything. And we will see you this weekend at Symphony Hall. Thank you again.